New York City, summer, 1981. The city that never sleeps is experiencing something of a renaissance. After years of economic darkness, bankruptcy, urban decay, Manhattan is beginning to breathe again. The arts are flourishing. The literary world is electric. And at the center of it all, a story that America cannot get enough of. A man who grew up behind bars, who taught himself to read, who taught himself to write, who channeled decades of suffering inside institutions into one of the most celebrated prison memoirs ever published. His name is Jack Henry Abbott, and New York has decided he is its greatest redemption story. Dinner parties, television appearances, standing ovations, the toast of Manhattan's intellectual elite. 6 weeks. That is how long Jack Henry Abbott breathes free air before a young man named Richard Adan goes to work a late-night shift and never comes home. This is not a story about a monster. It is something far more unsettling than that. This is a story about what happens when we choose not to see, when we allow a beautiful narrative to blind us to an inconvenient truth, and when the consequences of that choice fall not on those who made it, but on those who never had a say. To understand what happened on that sidewalk in the East Village in the early hours of July 18, 1981, you have to go back. Way back. Jack Henry Abbott was born on January 21, 1944. His childhood was not a childhood in any meaningful sense of the word. A father who was absent. A mother who was unable to cope. The state steps in early. Abbott is shuffled through a series of foster homes, institutions, juvenile detention facilities. He learns very quickly that the world is not a safe place, that trust is a liability, that survival requires a particular kind of hardness, an armor that once built is almost impossible to remove. By the time he is 12 years old, Jack Abbott has already spent more time in state institutions than in anything resembling a home. At 18, Abbott commits his first serious crime, check fraud. He is sentenced to a reformatory. The state has him now, and it will not let go easily. Inside the reformatory, Abbott kills another inmate. A fight, the details disputed, but the outcome is not. A man is dead, and Jack Abbott's sentence extends dramatically. He is transferred to the Utah State Prison, a grown facility, for a young man who had barely known the outside world. This is where Jack Abbott truly grows up. Inside the walls, inside the hierarchy, inside the brutal and unwritten code of the American maximum security prison system. The years accumulate. Abbott proves to be what the system calls a difficult inmate. He escapes briefly in 1971, robs a bank, is captured. More time is added. More walls. More years. More hardening. But something else is happening inside Jack Abbott. Something the system does not anticipate. He is reading, voraciously, philosophy, politics, literature. He is writing, filling notebooks with observations, reflections, with a voice that is raw and urgent and undeniably compelling. Jack Abbott is becoming a writer. Abbott reads that Norman Mailer, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Naked and the Dead, is researching his novel about convicted killer Gary Gilmore. Abbott writes to him. What follows is one of the most consequential pen-pal relationships in American literary history. Abbott's letters arrive at Mailer's desk with tremendous force. Mailer is electrified. He writes back. The correspondence deepens. Abbott articulates the interior world of the American prison system with a clarity and intensity that Mailer has never encountered. He tells Mailer things no criminologist could. No sociologist. No journalist who spent a weekend behind bars. He describes the psychology of incarceration from the inside. The way time moves differently. The way violence becomes language. The way years inside institutions rewires a human being at the most fundamental level. Mailer is convinced. This man is a genuine literary talent. More than that, he is a voice that America needs to hear. Random House agrees. Abbott's letters are compiled into a manuscript. The book is titled In the Belly of the Beast. And before it even hits shelves, the literary world is buzzing. Advanced copies circulate. The response is extraordinary. Reviews pour in. Glowing. Unanimous. Breathless. Jack Abbott is a phenomenon. Norman Mailer does not stop at publishing. He picks up his pen once more and writes to the United States Parole Board. His letter is passionate, eloquent, persuasive. He argues that Abbott's rehabilitation is genuine, that his literary talent represents exactly the kind of transformation the prison system claims to pursue, that keeping this man behind bars would be a profound waste of human potential. Other literary figures add their voices, a chorus of New York's most respected voices singing the same song. Let him go. He is ready. June 5, 1981. The parole board opens the door. Jack Henry Abbott walks out of the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. He is 37 years old. He has spent all but a handful of months of his adult life behind bars. He blinks in the sunlight. New York City awaits. Mailer hosts him at dinner parties. Publishers court him. Journalists interview him. He is photographed, celebrated, embraced. The greatest rehabilitation story America has ever seen, or so everyone chooses to believe. Here is what the dinner party guests do not talk about. Here is what the glowing reviews do not mention. Here is what the parole board chooses to look past. The red flags, and there are many. The book itself. In the Belly of the Beast. Read it carefully, not as literature, not as social commentary, but as a document, a confession. Abbott does not romanticize prison violence. He explains it, with the precision of someone who has lived it deeply. There is a passage in the book that the prosecution will later read aloud in a courtroom. Abbott describes in specific and clinical detail how a prison confrontation escalates, how a man positions himself, how he moves. He is not describing something he witnessed. He is describing something he knows. The literary world reads these passages and sees unflinching honesty, raw truth-telling, brave self-examination. What they perhaps should see is a map, written by a man who has not left that world behind, who may not know how. The prison psychiatrists, they are not invited to the dinner parties. Their reports do not appear in the book reviews, but they exist, filed in Abbott's prison records, spanning decades. The assessments are consistent, concerning, language describing an antisocial personality, an inability to regulate emotional responses, profound damage from years of institutionalization, and a serious likelihood of future violence. These are not the words of one person with an agenda. They are the shared conclusion of multiple professionals over multiple years across multiple facilities. The parole board has access to these files. Norman Mailer does not request them, and perhaps more importantly, does not appear to know they exist. The escape. It is documented. In 1971, Jack Abbott escaped from prison. He did not walk out on a legal technicality. He did not pursue any channels available to him. He ran, and then he robbed a bank. This is the behavior of a man who does not accept the authority of boundaries, who responds to restriction with flight, who, when cornered, acts. Yet this chapter of Abbott's history receives considerably less attention than his literary correspondence. In the world of 1981 New York, a man's prose carries more weight than his record. The halfway house. Abbott is placed in a halfway house upon his release. Standard procedure. A transitional environment. Structured support. The bridge between incarceration and independence. Those who interact with Abbott in this setting note something. A tension beneath the surface. A difficulty with the ordinary friction of everyday life. Small things. The kind of minor frustrations that most people absorb without thought. Abbott does not absorb them easily. He has spent nearly 2 decades in an environment where a perceived slight is an existential threat, where the failure to respond to disrespect can get you killed. He knows no other way of operating. And yet nobody raises this observation loudly enough for anyone with authority to hear it. The literary world's blind spot. Here is perhaps the most profound red flag of all. And it does not belong to Abbott. It belongs to the people who championed him. Norman Mailer. Brilliant, perceptive, experienced. A man who had spent decades examining the darkest corners of American life through his writing. He could not see, or perhaps chose not to see, that the qualities that made Abbott's writing so compelling were the same qualities that made him dangerous. The authenticity, the immediacy, the raw and unmediated connection to violence. It was not a literary device. It was a personality. The literary world fell in love with Jack Abbott's voice without fully reckoning with the man producing it. They celebrated his darkness as art, while the prison system's psychiatrists were trying to tell them that this darkness is not a metaphor. It is not a narrative choice. It is who this man is, and who he may always be. 6 weeks. Jack Henry Abbott is free for 6 weeks. And every single one of those red flags is still waving. Nobody is looking. June 1981. New York City. Jack Henry Abbott steps into a world he has read about, written about, dreamed about, but fundamentally does not know how to live in. For most people released from prison after a long sentence, the outside world is overwhelming. The noise, the pace, the infinite number of decisions that must be made every single day. What to eat, where to go, how to respond. In prison, these decisions are made for you. The institution provides a terrible kind of clarity. Rules, hierarchies, predictable consequences. Abbott has lived inside that structure for the better part of 2 decades. It is the only adult world he truly knows. Now he is standing on Manhattan sidewalks, riding subway trains, sitting at dinner tables with Pulitzer Prize winners. And somewhere beneath the surface, the adjustment is not going smoothly. Abbott's book is published in June 1981, the same month he is released. The timing is extraordinary, and extraordinarily complicated, because Abbott is not easing quietly into civilian life. He is thrust immediately into the spotlight. Interviews, reviews, literary events. His face, his voice, his story, everywhere. This is not a gradual re-entry. This is an immersion. From a maximum security cell to the center of New York's cultural conversation in a matter of weeks. The psychological weight of this transition is something no one appears to have considered. Abbott moves between 2 New Yorks simultaneously. By day, he inhabits the world of literary Manhattan. Champagne, conversation, the comfortable confidence of the celebrated. By night, he returns to the halfway house. Sign-in times, curfews, check-ins, the machinery of supervised release. And inside him, these 2 worlds create a friction, tension. He is being told by the literary world that he is extraordinary, that he is free, that he has arrived. He is being told by the system that he is still watched, still managed, still accounted for. Which voice does a man with Abbott's history listen to? Which world does he actually inhabit? And what happens when those 2 worlds collide with a third? Richard Adan is 22 years old, an aspiring actor and playwright, married to Zuzu Adan, son-in-law of Henry Howard Adan, owner of the Billabong Cafe, a small modest restaurant in the East Village. Richard works the late-night shift, because that is what you do when family depends on you. Because the hours between midnight and dawn are hours he can afford to give. The daylight hours belong to his dreams, his writing, his auditions, his quietly building future. He has no connection to Jack Abbott's story, no role in his incarceration, no part in his release. He is simply a young man showing up, doing the work, being present. July 17, 1981. Evening. Abbott arrives at the Billabong Cafe with 2 female companions. The evening is warm. The cafe is quiet and modest. Abbott asks to use the restroom. Richard Adan explains patiently that the cafe does not have a public restroom. It is the most ordinary exchange imaginable. The kind that happens 1,000 times a night in 1,000 New York establishments. A minor inconvenience. Nothing more. For Richard Adan, it is a routine moment in a routine shift. For Jack Henry Abbott, something else is happening entirely. To understand what Abbott experiences in that moment, you have to understand the world he comes from. In prison, every interaction is loaded. Every request denied carries a message. Every perceived slight is a challenge to your standing, your safety, your survival. Abbott has spent the better part of 2 decades in an environment where how you respond to being told no defines who you are, where backing down means weakness, where weakness invites predation. He has been out of that environment for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The intellectual understanding that civilian life operates by different rules does not automatically override nearly 2 decades of deeply conditioned response. The survival instincts of prison are still running. Underneath the dinner parties. Underneath the book reviews. Underneath the celebrated literary voice. Still running. Abbott leaves the Billabong Cafe that evening. He spends the remaining hours of July 17th moving through the city. What he is thinking during those hours we cannot know with certainty. But we know what he does. Because shortly before 5 o'clock in the morning on July 18th, 1981, Jack Henry Abbott walks back into the Billabong Cafe. Not because he is hungry. Not because he wants coffee. He has unfinished business. At least in his mind. Richard Adan is still working. The cafe is quiet at this hour. The city outside beginning its slow shift from night to morning. Abbott approaches Adan. Words are exchanged. The witnesses inside the cafe observe the conversation. They observe Abbott's demeanor. Something is wrong. Abbott asks Adan to step outside. In the world Jack Abbott comes from, that phrase has only one meaning. Richard Adan may not know this. He is 22 years old. He has not spent his life inside prison walls. He does not speak that language. He steps outside. What happens next takes only seconds. Abbott produces a knife. Richard Adan sustains a fatal wound. He collapses on the sidewalk outside the cafe where he works, where his family depends on him, where he spent his evenings funding his dreams. Jack Henry Abbott walks away, not running, walking, as if the weight of what he has just done does not register, or registers and simply does not matter. 5 o'clock in the morning. A young man lies on a sidewalk in the East Village. The city begins to wake around him. Unaware, as cities always are. Richard Adan is rushed to the hospital. The medical team works quickly. Not quickly enough. Richard Adan is pronounced dead. A husband, a son-in-law, a writer, gone. New York City homicide responds. The scene is secured. Witnesses are interviewed while memories are fresh. The cafe staff, the patrons, the people who were nearby. The picture assembles quickly. A description of the suspect. Physical details. What he was wearing. How he moved. And a name. Because Abbott had been inside the cafe earlier that evening with 2 companions who know who he is. Within hours of Richard Adan's death, law enforcement knows exactly who they are looking for. Jack Henry Abbott, the literary world's newest star, is now its most wanted fugitive. Abbott does not stay in New York. He understands immediately the severity of what has occurred. He moves, south and west, away from the city, away from the cameras and the literary agents and the dinner party invitations. Back into the anonymous America he understands far better. He assumes a different name. He finds work, physical labor, far from Manhattan, far from the halfway house, far from the consequences bearing down on him. He surfaces in Louisiana, working in the oil fields near Morgan City. A man nobody knows, a man with no apparent past, just hands and hours and the Gulf Coast heat. Back in Manhattan, the literary world is in shock. The reviews praising In the Belly of the Beast are still on newsstands. Abbott's face is still in the newspapers. But the context has changed entirely. Norman Mailer faces a press that is no longer interested in his literary opinions. They want to know one thing. How do you feel about what your advocacy has done? Mailer's responses are careful, pained. He speaks of tragedy, of his genuine belief in rehabilitation, of his real affection for Abbott's talent, a position that satisfies no one. The Adan family retains legal counsel. They intend to pursue every avenue available to them, both criminal and civil, against Abbott, and against those whose intervention made his freedom possible. September 23, 1981. Authorities locate Abbott at the labor camp near Morgan City, Louisiana. He is approached. He does not resist. The man who walked away from a sidewalk in the East Village without looking back now sits quietly as he is taken into custody. He is returned to New York City, the same city that celebrated him 6 weeks earlier. The cameras are there again. But nobody is applauding. Abbott is charged with murder in the second degree. He pleads not guilty. His legal team argues self-defense. That Richard Adan was the aggressor. That Abbott responded from a place of genuine fear, conditioned by decades of institutionalization. The prosecution listens to this argument and opens a copy of In the Belly of the Beast. They begin marking passages. In the months between Abbott's arrest and his trial, a quieter reckoning takes place across the literary world. Writers and intellectuals who signed letters, who attended dinners, who celebrated the narrative of rehabilitation. They begin to sit with what they contributed. Some speak publicly, acknowledging the role of their enthusiasm, the way a compelling narrative can make you overlook an inconvenient truth. Others say nothing, which is perhaps its own kind of answer. January 1982. The trial of Jack Henry Abbott begins in Manhattan. The courtroom is filled. Journalists, legal observers, members of the literary community, the Adan family, sitting quietly, waiting for something that will never fully feel like justice, but is all the law can offer. The prosecution builds its case carefully. Witness testimony from those inside the Billabong Cafe, the physical evidence, the medical examiner's findings, and the book. Passages from In the Belly of the Beast are read aloud in court. Abbott's own words, describing with care the mechanics of a confrontation, the psychology of a man shaped by institutional violence. The jury hears Abbott's voice through his own prose. You cannot cross-examine a book, but you can read it to a jury. The defense argues self-defense, that Abbott perceived a genuine threat, that his response was conditioned, not chosen. The prosecution counters with a simple and devastating observation. Richard Adan was unarmed. Richard Adan was a young man doing his job. Richard Adan stepped outside not knowing what that meant. Norman Mailer takes the stand, the man whose pen helped open the prison gates. Mailer does not recant his belief in Abbott's talent. He speaks carefully, thoughtfully, but he stands in a courtroom facing the consequences of his advocacy. And there is nothing eloquent enough to say. The literary world watches one of its most celebrated figures reduced to a supporting character in a story about the limits of good intentions. January 21, 1982. Abbott's 38th birthday. The jury returns. Guilty. Not murder in the second degree. Manslaughter in the first degree. The jury accepts that Abbott's deeply conditioned responses influenced his actions that morning. But not enough to excuse them. Never enough to excuse them. Sentence: 15 years to life. Jack Henry Abbott is returned to prison. The place that made him. The place he never truly left. The Adan family pursues damages in civil court, both against Abbott and against Norman Mailer. The civil proceedings find in favor of the Adan family. Mailer reaches a settlement, contributing proceeds from the very book his advocacy helped bring into the world. The same book the prosecution read from in a criminal courtroom. Year after year, Abbott appears before the parole board. Year after year, the Adan family appears too. Zuzu, Henry, carrying Richard's absence into every hearing room, making sure the board sees it, feels it, cannot process it away. Year after year, parole is denied. From his cell, Abbott publishes a second book. My Return, 1987. His account of the trial, his continued assertion of self-defense, his perspective on what happened in the East Village that July morning. The literary world receives it quietly. The appetite for Jack Abbott's voice has been replaced by something else. Discomfort, guilt, the particular silence of people who know they got something profoundly wrong. February 10, 2002. Jack Henry Abbott is found dead in his cell at a correctional facility in New York State. Suicide. He is 58 years old. He has spent the majority of his life behind the walls he wrote about so compellingly. In his prison file, a notation that had followed him for decades. No chance of rehabilitation. The prison psychiatrists who were never invited to the dinner parties had said so all along. Richard Adan never got the chance to find out who he would become. Abbott took that from him. On a sidewalk, before the city woke up, before anyone was watching. It is always the final question, and it is always the hardest. Because why demands more than facts? It demands understanding. And understanding in a case like this is deeply uncomfortable. Because the answers implicate more than one person, more than one institution, more than one failure. Why did Abbott do what he did? The legal system settled on manslaughter, accepting that Abbott's actions were shaped by his conditioning. But that is a legal answer, not a human one. Jack Abbott spent the formative years of his adult life inside a maximum security prison. Not for a year, not for 5 years, for the better part of 2 decades. In that environment, the rules of human interaction are rewritten entirely. A perceived challenge to your dignity is not an embarrassment. It is a threat to your physical safety. A confrontation not met with decisiveness does not result in awkwardness. It results in predation. Abbott's responses had been shaped by years of conditioning to meet perceived threat with immediate action. He did not choose this. The institution chose it for him. Repeatedly, relentlessly, over nearly 2 decades. When Richard Adan asked Abbott to step outside, whatever Richard meant by those words, Abbott's entire lived experience told him only one thing. And he responded accordingly. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation. And the difference between those 2 words matters enormously. Because one closes the conversation, and the other opens it. Why was Abbott released? The parole system in 1981 was navigating competing pressures. Prison overcrowding. A strong belief in rehabilitation. And in Abbott's case, something more unusual. The weight of literary celebrity. Norman Mailer was not an ordinary citizen writing a character reference. He was one of the most decorated writers in American history. His advocacy carried genuine cultural authority. And the parole board is made up of human beings. Human beings who are aware of cultural prestige. Who are not entirely immune to the argument that a man who writes like this cannot be beyond redemption. The prison psychiatrists said otherwise. Their assessments were consistent and clear, spanning decades, crossing multiple facilities. But they did not have Pulitzer Prizes. They did not have publishing contracts. They did not have the ear of New York's literary establishment. And so their voices were heard less loudly. This is why the Adan family pursued civil damages against Mailer. Not because he held the knife, but because he held the pen, and used it to open a door that professionals in criminal psychology were urging him to leave closed. Why did nobody see this coming? They did. That is perhaps the most haunting truth of this entire case. People saw it coming. Prison psychiatrists documented it. The parole system's own evaluation processes identified it, and were overridden by enthusiasm, by narrative, by the seductive power of a good story. Jack Abbott's story was irresistible. The self-taught prisoner intellectual. The raw literary talent emerging from institutional darkness. The redemption arc that America loves above all others. It was a story people wanted to be true. And when we want something to be true, we become very skilled at not examining the evidence that suggests otherwise. We read the passages about violence and call them literature. We review the escape from prison and call it the past. We hear the psychiatrist's warnings and call them institutional bias. We tell ourselves the story we want, and we silence the story we don't. Why does this case still matter? Because Richard Adan is not the only person who has paid the price for a system's blind spots. The Abbott case forces a conversation that remains unresolved today. About the relationship between art and character. A person can be a genuine literary talent and a genuine danger to the public. These 2 things are not mutually exclusive, and confusing them has consequences. About the limits of rehabilitation as a belief system. The desire to believe in human transformation must be balanced against honest assessment of risk. Compassion and caution are not enemies. They are partners. And when one overwhelms the other, people get hurt. About the weight of advocacy. When influential voices speak on behalf of those without power, that influence carries real responsibility, measured in real consequences. Norman Mailer lived with that responsibility for the rest of his life. In interviews throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he grapples publicly with his role. He never fully absolves himself. But he never fully condemns himself either. History has been less forgiving than he was of himself. Why Richard Adan? The cruelest question. And the simplest answer. Richard Adan was there. He was working a late-night shift in a small cafe. He was doing what young people building their lives do. Showing up. Putting in the hours. Being present. He had no connection to Jack Abbott's story. No role in his incarceration. No part in his release. He was simply a young man who happened to be working on a night when a man walked through his door carrying nearly 2 decades of institutional conditioning and made a choice. Richard Adan deserved none of what happened to him. Not a single moment of it. Why does this stay with us? Because it sits at the intersection of everything we struggle with as a society. Justice and mercy. Art and responsibility. Redemption and risk. Institutional failure and individual accountability. The celebrated voices of the intellectual world and the quiet anonymity of the people those voices sometimes fail to see. Richard Adan was not famous. He did not have a book deal. He did not have a Pulitzer Prize winner writing letters on his behalf. He had a late-night shift, and a life he was quietly and carefully building. And that should have been enough. It should have been more than enough. It should have been everything. Henry Abbott wrote beautifully about the cost of a life lived inside walls. He understood that cost intellectually, philosophically, as a writer. But on a sidewalk in the East Village at 5 o'clock on a July morning in 1981, he demonstrated something else entirely. That understanding a cost and truly reckoning with it are not the same thing. Richard Adan reckoned with it. With his life. And that is something no book, no review, no literary prize, no parole board decision, no dinner party conversation, no beautiful sentence can ever undo. In the Belly of the Beast was a New York Times bestseller. It remains in print today. Richard Adan never got to see his plays performed. This documentary is dedicated to Richard Adan. And to every person whose story was never celebrated. Never published. Never championed. But mattered just the same.
The case may be closed, but the story, never forgotten. Thank you for watching Truth Finder.